Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this edition of our placemaking webinar series. We're so excited to be bringing you today's topic, Don't Look Back, Equity and Recovery in Public Space During COVID-19. I'm really excited to announce our speakers today. First of all, we have Maggie Parker, founder, Innovan Neighborhoods in Dallas, Texas, Madison Morine, analyst, HR&A Advisors, Inc. in Dallas, Texas. Bobby Boone, founder and chief strategist from Access in Washington, D.C. And Nidhi Gulati, senior director of projects and programs at Project for Public Spaces in New York, New York. Just a couple of things about today's webinar. In advance, we asked our participants to share questions with us that they would like to hear addressed throughout this webinar. In addition, we would love to hear from you throughout the webinar, so feel free to chat your comments, ideas, thoughts, given the topics that are discussed today in the chat feature, because we would love to hear from you. So now I would like to go ahead and pass this over to Nidhi Gulati, who could please turn on your camera to get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. As we live through this unprecedented time, we're learning that each of us is facing a different pandemic, depending on our social, cultural, economic backgrounds and identities. Many of these factors are outside of our control and systematically entrenched. So as more states open up, we thought it best to talk about the equitable recovery, but most importantly, recovery for who before we speak to the how, and usher into a new normal because the past wasn't good enough. It left many people in our communities much more open to vulnerabilities. And we are so fortunate today to have a great group of panelists with diverse backgrounds and practices to share their insights with us. I would like to invite Maggie Parker to quickly introduce herself before we move into this webinar.
Hi, my name is Maggie Parker. I'm founder of Innovan Neighborhoods, which is a real estate development and consulting firm. We focus on community-oriented projects that serve, the DFW area and partner with key stakeholders to just move their concepts and ideas forward. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Next, I would like to hear from Bobby Boone. Bobby, if you could introduce yourself quickly, that'll be great.
All right, I made it. Greetings all. I am Bobby Boone. I'm the founder and chief strategist at Access. Access focus on equitable retail. So understanding how the real estate plays a part of that, considering pathways for entrepreneurship, since many national brands, site selection processes do not really equate to serving the needs of many underserved communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. And Madison, over to you for your introductions.
How's it going, guys? My name is Madison Morine. I am an analyst at HR&A Advisors, and a lot of my work right now is in the realm of parks and public spaces, innovation districts, and providing affordable housing. It's definitely been impacted pretty heavily by COVID, but looking forward to diving into those conversations with you guys soon.
Fantastic. Juliet, if you could leave us with the front slide to begin the conversation, that'll be great. So to center the conversation around equity, it's important for us to first talk about what that means. And we started with this definition that we borrowed from Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies. Equitable development combines multiple people and place-based strategies to improve local communities physically, socially, and economically in ways that are equitable, fair, and impartial to all elements of the population. Now, this definition was a starting point for us. But as we think about operationalizing this definition and really fitting it into our work and making it actionable, I want to ask each one of our panelists, does this definition work in the context of your work? Maggie, how about you tell us, does this work for the work that you do?
So I agree. This is definitely a foundational piece, because I'm mainly on the real estate side and really thinking about how do we finance deals. The thoughts around really thinking about both, not only the physical, but both the social and economic impact that a building has on a neighborhood, on the people that live there, is key, right? Like, so in the space that I'm in, for folks that are not thinking about this issue all the time, it's definitely a great start. Things that are missing in this conversation are really around race, right? And then also, how do we really address just some of the inequities and try to find opportunities to, I guess, make things more equitable. So for me, this definition is a baseline. It basically allows folks that are new into this conversation to really think broadly around how development can impact neighborhoods.
What about you, Bobby? What do you think works? What doesn't work?
All right, I had to turn myself off mute. Yes, so agreed. I do think it's a little too ill-defined on the actual outcomes that are desired. One of the things I think about is the multiple people in place-based strategies. Not all of in the community. Yes, it goes on to talk about how it benefits, all elements of the population, but not necessarily including them within the actual strategy setting up front is something that I think we could really improve on as a profession, and then to come out with better physical, social, and economic opportunities for all of the population segments, specifically those for the segments of the population that have been historically redlined or left out of the conversation.
Absolutely. Over to you, Madison.
Yeah, I agree with both of those points. I definitely think it's missing some sort of topic around race. And I think another big thing with what makes equitable development equitable is not only seeing how the intentions of your project are going to impact people, but what are these sort of side-off consequences of the development that you're working on, and how is that going to affect people in ways that you wouldn't have thought about. So I think it also needs to consider what are these other effects that we're not thinking of that might reach outside of this community or whatever it is to impact other people. So
I agree with all of you. There are so many things that need to be considered when we think about each one of our starting points are different, each one of our realities are different, and a definition that allows us to address that gap is very important, so we can actually think about prioritization in terms of resources and working with communities, and that's what this definition doesn't yet capture. So moving towards a more open definition that allows us to talk more about making it actionable. Madison was kind enough to share another definition with us. Next slide, please. So here's another definition that Madison shared with us from an internal equity group working within HR&A to give everyone a sense of how definitions are transformed and broadened to make them actionable. So for the purposes of this conversation and keeping it iterative in people's minds, when we achieve equitable development, we increase the capacity of people of color to strengthen their communities and determine their own future and that of their neighborhoods. We distribute the benefits and burdens of growth equitably among people of all races, ethnic backgrounds, incomes, and geographies/neighborhoods. We encourage multicultural communities where tenured and newcomer residents can thrive, and we provide meaningful choices for the most impacted people of color to live, work, and define their own culture throughout all neighborhoods. So thank you for sharing that with us, Madison. So the overall flow of this webinar is shaped really by the questions that were sent to us by the participants, by all of you. Looking over them, we categorize those into inquiries that will shape the rest of this webinar. So we'll begin with the impact of COVID-19 on the lives of our panelists and their work. Then we'll jump into relationship and reciprocity between private and public space, followed by comfort, perceived safety, and inclusion in public spaces. Then we'll talk a little bit about future investment in public space, design and programming, followed by sharing of resources to support public spaces. And we'll end it with priorities for policy change and giving an opportunity for our panelists to share some food for thought with us. Next slide, please. So COVID-19 hits, and it shakes our entire world. However, people who are working on climate change mitigation and social justice knew that pandemics are inevitable. It was a matter of when. And as it hit, it impacted each of us in very different ways based on who we are and where we come from. So I would like to hear from all of you. Tell us a little bit, how has your life and your work been impacted in the past 3 or 4 months? And we'll begin with you, Madison. If you could share that with us, that'll be great.
Yeah. So I think personally, I mean, I've seen quite a shift in just the types of projects and work that we're typically pursuing or are working on. Public entities and municipalities have become more of a driver for some of the work that I'm involved with, just because a lot of private enterprise is struggling right now and also doesn't know necessarily where the market is headed, especially when you're looking at retail, which is something that I'm excited to learn from Bobby about, because there's really no telling what is going to happen and sort of the appropriate steps that we need to take to achieve these goals of equitable development. I mean, even from an external to work standpoint, I mean, I was working on community dinners before this, and how do you set up community dinners now when you can't get people to gather and you can't have, you know, a couple of people in a room together, you know? So there have been quite a few changes. So adjusting to these things is a bit challenging, but I mean, we'll see what we can do and we'll make it work. So we'll move forward.
Yeah, Bobby, tell us how your work has changed. Madison kind of handed over to you. That was very fluid.
Right. So yes, you know, the world of retail has, you know, been changing forever. Yeah, we're faced with dying malls and, you know, brands that are closing at exponential rates prior to COVID. Small business preservation has been on the minds of so many, you know, before COVID, specifically dealing with gentrification within some of our city centers. And then, you know, we're thinking about it even more so now. And so, you know, prior to COVID, how I work changed because, you know, I was going to the site, being able to meet with the business owners, establishing that level of trust within communities. Whereas now most of my projects have been relegated over to a digital format. And it's very hard to build relationships as effectively digitally, especially when you're a foreigner entering into a community to provide, you know, technical assistance. However, I think that, you know, the topics and all the knowledge I've gained historically from about small business preservation and small business growth has really prepared a unique opportunity within my work to actually work with various municipalities on the subject, determining how to design policies, programs, and other strategies for long-term sustainability of tenants.
How about the people that you work with, Maggie, in your work on a day-to-day basis? How has that been impacted?
Yeah, so at the beginning of this, I'd say a couple of things definitely had to pause, right? Because the organizations that I work with are either, you know, anchor institutions in their neighborhood. So when they're thinking about real estate, that's a long-term strategy. They needed to pivot and provide food or provide, you know, funding for people to stay in their homes, or, you know, they switched to immediately doing grants for COVID-19, right? So that really, their shift to meet immediate needs, which is obviously extremely important, you know, made some of our work kind of, hey, we'll take a pause, which I was happy to do, right? And then as I look, and as we all look towards long-term strategies and how to address this, there's definitely an increased need for affordable housing, or increased need for spaces for small businesses to continue to operate, right, at rents that actually make sense for the work that they do. And so I've actually been working a lot more on basically being in a position to acquire land and property. As the economy changes and continues to change, there are like things called vulture funds, right? Where folks are really thinking about how they can take advantage of the decreased prices and values. And so really trying to position our group to be a player in that space with the thought of how do we acquire property that has, you know, a long-term trajectory to meet community needs. And so I've been working on that a lot more recently.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So I think about social innovation a lot. I study about it a lot, and my professors under that program keep trying to instill this thinking in us that solving complex social problems takes the intersection and collaboration between the public, the private, and the impact sectors. So with that in mind, we know that on a daily basis, the private and public space even rely very heavily on each other for success. For example, shops rely on the sidewalk for their vitality and the other way around. So I want to hear from the three of you, how are you seeing that relationship play out in your work at this time? And I actually want to start with Bobby, and particularly around, you work a lot with local businesses, small local businesses who may or may not even have access to enough private space. So how are you seeing that relationship play out right now?
Whew, yes, that's a challenging subject for many, especially in dense urban environments where you have smaller retail spaces with maybe 8 to 12 feet of sidewalk in front, and then you're next to so many other businesses, and we're all competing for that same space. Having private public space dialogue within those two spaces. I'm like personifying both of those spaces, but creating that dialogue is essential for them moving forward. And one of the things I've been talking about with different planning organizations or business improvement districts is how can we identify those areas proactively. Understand, hey, we have a lot of business density here. We might need to consider, closing down on-street parking in order to allow for more queuing and have really defined lanes for customers to, wait, as well as pedestrians to walk by. You've seen in Berkeley, California, where they have, decided to shut down entire streets in the conversation in order to accomplish this goal. That also provides for different cafe and outdoor seating. One of the things I do recommend in order to keep equity at top of the conversation is understanding that, business owners are already like without enough time in order to get day-to-day operations done, especially considering how many things that they're changing at a rapid pace in order to pivot given COVID, that they need planning and government agencies to go ahead and proactively give them the permit instead of having them to come in and apply for the permit. And then even to understand what resources are available, that needs to be a proactive communication, because asking a business owner to take additional time to research these different programs and policies, whether that's for a sidewalk cafe or something else, it's going to be very strenuous, and especially if it's dealing with the amount of paperwork that's typically supplemented those application processes. One of the things I've seen in Mobile, Alabama is that they have done one of their downtown district management organizations gave $2,000 for small businesses to have architectural support in order to navigate how do they integrate both their public and private spaces. So, thinking about ways, how can you reallocate funds? How can you make the process easier are two separate strategies in order to increase equity within this conversation.
And Madison, you really work at the intersection of these two realms a lot, the private capital, private space, and public capital, and even the quasi-public and private spaces. What are you seeing in terms of these relationships in your work?
I mean, I feel as though the situation that we've been put in is sort of it's placed a magnifying glass over all of the issues that were already taking place, either from a public perspective or a private perspective. I mean, when you're looking at how health impacts people, how can you make things more inclusive when things seem to be getting more divided? How can you make these things equitable? And it, like one of the things that I think has been apparent to anybody in a major city is how parks have become this sort of forefront for bringing people to the public realm. But I think that then gets tough whenever you're looking at sort of this intersection that you talk about with the private realm also, because if people go to parks and then they intend to go to some sort of retail or something like that nearby, but are struggling to do that or can't do that because it's no longer accessible, then how do you keep people involved with the community? And how do you keep businesses, I would say even more importantly than businesses, but workers sort of alive and able to continue to move on? And I think that's been really tough. And I think this decline that we're sort of seeing, or at least I feel like is happening with the interaction between private and public, I think is making things a little more difficult. And kind of like Bobby said, private business already has so much going on. They're trying to stay above water. So they need access to permitting or whatever it is to give them access to their sidewalks or to additional parking to where, I don't know, if it's a restaurant, they can put tables, or if it's some sort of art studio, they can access this public space and maybe put their art outside. I think some interesting ideas that could counter this or improve this relationship between public and private is what's happening to vacant spaces right now and how are they being used? Is there some sort of shift that could take place there? Could that be an opportunity for arts, which is a struggling area right now, I think, in all cities before COVID and definitely after COVID? Is that an opportunity for them to maybe use these vacant areas in a more open space? I think those are some of the things that should be considered, especially from an intersecting perspective. But you've got to make it easier on businesses and the private industry to access some of these public amenities.
And Maggie, you're involved in a totally different conversation than what our two other panelists just talked about, in something that may even lead us to believe, is there a relationship at all between private and public space? What are you seeing currently in terms of that relationship, or if it's even there at all?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely a relationship there, right? And in this time, both Madison and Bobby hit the nail on the head. And we'll just kind of use sidewalks, right? It's kind of the baseline because that's really what's in conversation right now. At this point, and I'm just talking about what's going on in Dallas, and I'm sure across the U.S., patios and sidewalks are prime real estate, right? Like that's how you can start to make additional money, right? Whether that's have that be a dining area, whether that's a place where you can now sell your merchandise that is a little more safer for people. It allows a little bit more social distancing. And that's almost counterintuitive to how a lot of buildings are planned. Because when you think about sidewalks, it essentially reduces the square footage that your building can have, right? And so I think there's going to come a point, whether that's coming from local governments or coming from architects, developers, et cetera, where there's this tension of like, well, how big do the sidewalks need to be? Because I can really make more money renting out this retail space or renting out these apartments versus like, well, now, you know, the sidewalk space that we have is really advantageous for us to continue to be safe and have perceived safety, right? Or now to have more space for people to make money because not as many people can be indoors. And so I think that relationship, I think that relationship between now public and private space brings a whole different connotation when we think about what areas look like, how you design and build buildings.
That is a perfect segue into our next question. So next slide, please. Let's talk about that idea of perceived safety. So comfort and perceived safety is crucial to the success of any public space, and especially in the context of where these spaces sit. Comfort and safety together make up for one of the 4 pillars of a great public space that Project for Public Spaces talks about. And they're also incredibly unique to each community, and some would argue to each human being. So tell us a little bit about, as we come out of this very uncomfortable time, what would make public spaces more comfortable and safe and inclusive for people that you work with? And these don't have to be just physical components alone. What makes people feel included, safe, and comfortable in the communities that you work with. We'll actually start with you, Maggie, and build on that for us, please.
Okay. So this question hit home a couple of different ways for me, because when I think about safety, comfort, those are feelings, right? Like you have a perception of being comforted, you have a perception of being safe, and those feelings vary honestly by somebody's personal background. So 9 times out of 10, well, let me start with this thought of like, most recently, this has probably been the last 2 months with the Ahmaud Arbery, we'll just say slaying, okay? He's running in his neighborhood, as many of us have had to do as a result of COVID-19, is to kind of be in your neighborhood just to get outdoors, to continue to exercise, right? But this is somebody who now is not safe walking in a public space in his own neighborhood. So for those that may look like him or have the same background as him, you know, do they feel safe even walking in a park or walking down the street, right? So this understanding of what it means to be safe, to me, it's a little bit hard in this time, but also with the context of like everyone, the perception of safety isn't always based on design. A lot of times it's based on the neighborhood that you're in, the background that you have. And, you know, even if we think about it from the sense of like COVID-19 and, you know, do people feel safe from just the pandemic and the disease, right? I think, so like if everyone has different thoughts of, you know, how bad the pandemic is or how you get the pandemic or how you can heal from the pandemic, well, then, you know, people are abiding by different social rules. And so when you get into the public space or you go to parks and you walk in your neighborhood, right, or you go to the store and some people are wearing masks and some people aren't, this conversation around safety now becomes like based on leadership and understanding of facts and understanding of, you know, what are the facts, right? So I'll stop there, but those are some of my thoughts.
Those are very important points that you made there, Maggie, thinking about who it is who designs our public spaces, who it is who is in a position of power. And those names and those faces have a huge implication of how safe and comfortable do we feel? Who is it who's designing kind of the world and the life around us? And the more we can see our realities and reflected in those who are our leaders and our identities reflected in the designs of our places have a huge impact, because you're absolutely right. I'm one of those people who would argue that the sense of comfort and safety does vary per human being. Each one of us is a different person, and our sense of comfort is different, and we each kind of create that. How about you, Bobby? What do you think? The communities that you work with, what is that definition, or what do those criteria look like?
Yeah, so in retail planning, we talk about this topic a lot because, you know, if you close your eyes and I say the word loitering, what do you imagine? Versus when I say lingering, what do you imagine? And, you know, in Black and Brown communities, we're often cited with loitering or as Black people in establishments or hanging outside, it's loitering, where lingering is a kind of perpetuated behavior that you actually want within retail because you want them to spend more money, you want them to sit on outside, come back in, etc. Throughout your district. And so, you know, it's already a very divisive conversation when you talk about comfort and perceived safety. One of the findings through a report I did probably about 5 years ago was that DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., which, you know, it's more affluent, et cetera, than Anacostia, which is more Black, less affluent, you know, they had more crime than Anacostia did. However, when you gauge people's temperature on that, they say, oh, Anacostia, of course, definitely has more crime. And so when you're thinking about, you know, how are we designing strategy, you have to also understand the cultural nuances of actually we're hanging outside. You know, one thing that I actually posed to some counterparts are just like, hey, the Black community, we have a porch, from historically. And we have like stayed on the porch in order because we may not have the best air conditioning as once those things came out. That's where you intersect with your community. That's the public space. And so, the front of storefronts become that porch. The front of, other businesses, et cetera, is that porch for us. And so how do we integrate some of those things within current thinking? And then specifically addressing kind of COVID implications, I think you find that, a lot of times the disruption that happens in commercial environments is because of either alcohol or music, playing too loud. And so how can we basically create a culturally relevant like cluster that's associated with each of these different backgrounds, as Maggie was alluding to? So places that you feel comfortable. All right, this park is going to have music playing, or this alleyway is going to have open beverage laws. These, whatever that actually looks like, in order to not only drive sales for the restaurants, but also make you feel like you're there and you're there with a purpose. And long term, I think there's an opportunity for communication. I think Maggie, talk about how we have so many different messages coming from audiences, whether that's federal, state, local, your best friend, and you just don't know how to dig through those things. And so having a consolidated communications campaign that can say, hey, here's how we're making you safe dealing with COVID, in this public space. We're requesting that you follow these protocols. We've even helped guide you through this process through sidewalk markings or vinyl stickers or posters, et cetera, to really help you in that step by step, because we understand you're learning and we're trying to help you learn at a faster pace.
And Madison, you really work with a lot of different types of communities, age groups, and other diversity categories. Tell us what you are seeing in terms of the nuances of comfort, inclusion, and safety there as they play out.
I mean, it goes along with much of Maggie and Bobby have mentioned, but this perception of what safety and comfort really look like. Like for example, like I was talking to this organization in West Dallas that's primarily Latinx based organization, and was asking them about parks around Dallas to just sort of get a sense of like where they feel comfortable going and where they would want to go and which parks they would want to spend their time. And when we started to talk about parks that you might find, I don't know, sort of east of the tollway, if you will, they not only felt less comfortable there, but they, like the word that one woman in particular used, she said that they didn't feel allowed. Like they didn't feel like they could go there. Like they've heard that it's this public park that people are able to go to, but they don't personally feel like they are given permission to go. And so I think that's a big issue, is you have these public spaces, public for everybody, and people don't feel like they're allowed to be at some public space. So I think a lot of it has to do with education, sort of like Bobby was saying, but how do you clarify these things? How can you make them more specific? How can you sort of paint the line of the boundaries and really, I don't know what opposite of boundaries are, but sort of the freedom or the lack of boundaries that people have an ability to access. And then I think a lot of it is this sense of education. So if it's education around race, I think that can get pretty uncomfortable for people, but at the same time, it's necessary. Or if it's education around COVID, I think the way that local, state, and federal government are all handling that education is very different, which makes the lines very confusing. So you're lacking this clarity. I have spent part of COVID in New York, and I've spent part of COVID in Texas. for the Texans out there, I quarantined for my 2 weeks when I came back, so don't worry, I didn't spread any of that. But there was a massive difference in how people in New York take that situation and how people in Texas take it. Granted, New York was the epicenter in the US, or is the epicenter in the US for this pandemic, but people treat it very differently. Everybody wore a mask. I would maybe see a couple of people every now and then not wearing a mask, but that was it. In Texas, grocery store, I mean, unless it's a Whole Foods where they say we don't want you in here unless you're wearing a mask, people are not wearing masks when they're going around. They're not wearing masks at retail. And so I think that the impacts of it are going to have the potential to be very bad for these public spaces, and in result are going to make people less comfortable and feel less safe about it. So I think in order to make people feel more comfortable and feel more safe, I think they need to be properly educated. And I think in order to do that, you have to skip the vague, sort of overarching level of description that you might normally tackle something with. And I think you have to choose specifics that you want to talk about or address with people, or else they'll feel uncomfortable with the conversation and almost feel like maybe they're being attacked. But if you make it some sort of specific thing for people to talk about and address and educate them on, then I think you can start to make people feel more comfortable. But I think a lot of it has to do with outreach, and how some things are even marketed or provided to people that come from different geographies. And that gets back to the equity standpoint. If public spaces are supposed to be this equitable avenue where everybody can have access to it, then why does it feel like some public spaces are built better or meant to carry and hold people better than other public spaces? Why are these sidewalks dingy and these aren't? Why are these getting investment and these aren't? So I think people have to feel like you care about them in order for them to feel like they can be comfortable. Because if you don't care about me, I'll never feel comfortable around you, I don't think. And I think that can be applied to organizations and governments as well. But I don't know, what I'm talking about now feels like issues that have existed in the country for years and years and years. So it's a bigger issue. But again, I think COVID puts a magnifying glass on some of this stuff, and some people either choose to ignore it or don't. So
that's a very important point you made there, Madison, about caring. Because if you show people that you care, then you'll ask them what makes them comfortable, and then the chances of those answers getting reflected in the decisions that get made about people's cities will start to show. But you have to care enough to ask, because walls are not always made of concrete and water and brick and mortar. They can be very invisible little things, and we can break them down if we just, again, care enough to ask. So that, again, blends perfectly into the next question. So next question, please. To let us dive into a little bit more into particular elements of design and programming that should be prioritized for investment in public spaces. I know that many designers and planners in our audiences would appreciate your thought on that, and we would want you to, not be able to speak on behalf of all the people that you worked with, but you yourselves, your lived realities, and the people that you most closely work with. What types of design and programming elements should be recipients of public investment going forward? And I'll share an example on that. In the transportation sector, and something that I feel, Vision Zero initiatives and funding in marginalized communities remains kind of poor. And that's true in many parts of the country. So reducing traffic-related fatalities on the street and mitigating those, the investment in marginalized communities is usually less. So if I were thinking from that perspective, I would say the next Vision Zero initiative should absolutely occur in a community where there are most fatalities that we already knew was marginalized. So things like that. Tell us what some of those should be. And again, I'll start with you, Madison, because you're on such a roll. Let's start with you.
Okay. I think choosing the biggest priority for me seems difficult. So if I can provide a couple, that That'd be awesome. But I think one of the...
This is not the one with one priority. This is the one with multiple priorities.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for the clarity. There we go. I think a starting point is, it goes back to kind of what you were building on with the caring piece and asking questions, but I think it's giving marginalized groups some sense of agency over what is going on. I think that is not only a great way of engaging with individuals, but it's also a great way to sort of get the results that you would want for a group that you don't understand. Like I can't speak for every group out there. I can't speak for every privileged, marginalized group, whatever it is. Like each of these groups has their own identity, and within that, each individual has their own identity. So I think you have to give them some sense of agency over what's going on and some power into what's going on. And I would guess in breaking that down, it's figuring out who has the power right now, where does the power lie, and how can that power then be divided out to people who typically don't have that power, again, the marginalized groups. From another standpoint, when I'm thinking of what I think would be great priorities for public space, in Texas and in Dallas specifically, there's not a whole lot of walkability. You have a couple of neighborhoods that have more walkability than others, but overall the city is not a walkable area. And so I think people don't touch their public space as much unless they're parking in that parking lot, walking across the sidewalk to get into that store. Like that's their touch point. But I think the things that would improve that, which to me feels so small, so it hurts whenever I see developers not thinking to add these little components in, but like how can you get more trees so that there's more shade? Because in Texas it's 100 degrees outside, and otherwise I'm not going to be on that parking lot or on that sidewalk. Like how can you give people shelter from their environment so that they can then access their environment, if that makes sense. I don't want to get too philosophical. I've been reading existentialist novels recently, but I mean that's kind of what I think that's my priority. I want to be able to access these spaces. In neighborhoods like Uptown, it feels like it might be easier to access that space via foot, but that space might not be nearly as inviting, comfortable, or even safe. I mean, the way people either drive or interact in these areas is not safe for pedestrians. So it has to include wider sidewalks in my mind, bigger trees, or just trees in general. You could even plant it small and let it grow. I'll take the time, but at least you're trying. But those are my two priorities right there.
Thanks, Madison. Maggie, I think he kind of alluded to you being the next person to share. What do you think? What are some of those priority investments that could be made?
Well, my first comment is, Madison, we're not walking outside because it's hot, okay? So let's just remember,
Exactly.
let's just remember that. No, but so I'll share my 3 priorities that I think are important, but I also just want to kind of put a lens on how we think about this issue. So one, I think engagement, as Madison said, is huge, right? Like you need more people that are involved in providing input around what public space looks like in their community. Access, right? And then thirdly, location, right? So you need more access to these type of amenities across all aspects of your cities, rural areas, etc. The thing that I want to focus on, and really something I saw as a trend in the questions, which was how do we get more, I guess either stakeholders or community organizations or individuals really engaged in what the future of public space looks like in their neighborhood, right? So like as we talk about engagement and we talk about locations, a lot of that takes advocacy. It takes funding and resources to do that. But the one thing I want to keep in mind, and I think is always important for those that are in a planning background or those that work in local government, like this is a privilege for us to be thinking about these issues, right? Like every day people are thinking about how do they feed their kids, how do they make their rent, right? Like, so the fact that there's a park down the street, they have no idea how it got there, right? Or they may not even have time to go to the community meetings to give input on these, on, you know, what it looks like. And so I don't want to fault people for that, but let's just acknowledge that that's a reality. And so what that means, though, is that those of us that have the privilege of having this conversation, we have to challenge ourselves, our personal networks, our offices, the folks that are in you know, leadership within our communities, to be thinking equitably on behalf of other people who do not have the time or the privilege to be thinking about these issues. And so I just wanted to throw that into the mix, because I think it's important to realize, don't get frustrated because the same priorities that you have and you spend your life work on, you know, it's not the same priorities for other people, because we are privileged to be talking about these issues.
That's a very, very important point, and something that we talk about a lot at Project for Public Spaces, and I personally care a lot about. Community engagement, community power, community ownership, and understanding how a community can engage with you, not enforcing a process on them, but really how can that community engage with you, and crafting a process that actually responds to that community's level of access and availability. Not some cookie cutter, this is what we're going to do for every project, but this is what we're going to do for this particular project because this particular community doesn't have time for evening meetings, but instead would talk to you on the phone or things like that. So it's very important to do that. And I would also put a little plug for, we did a webinar a few weeks ago that was particularly about community engagement in the time of COVID and beyond. So that would be interesting for some of our listeners. And I just wanted to plug in there. Before I turn it over to you, Bobby, what do you think? What do we need to be prioritizing?
I mean, I think you all hit it on the nail on the head. It's definitely engagement. But with engagement, I think what results from that is a diversity of public spaces. So not only, you know, ones that say check the box in a neighborhood plan, that oftentimes happen, but also ones that can say, oh, this is, you know, a parklet, or this is a temporary activation that's occurring in this, you know, vacant alley, whatever that may be. Just to know, it's, I think, a reiteration of investment time and time again when you have smaller in smaller bites of, like I say, I'm trying not to use investment again, but investment, bites of investment throughout your like neighborhood, because you say, oh, they not only put in a park, you know, 5 years ago, but each, you know, year they're doing some type of summer activation, which typically happens at like a business improvement district level or Main Street organization. However, many communities of color aren't necessarily equipped to have those organizations. So Main Street, you know, particularly have very strict like guidelines in terms of physical form. I mean, Urban Maine starts to, you know, provide a alternative to that. However, on the other side, you have your business improvement districts, which relies on taxing the actual property owners and being able to understand the issues that, you know, that really causes for smaller scale commercial districts. It is something that should be addressed. So, you know, that the level of taxes might not even provide provisions at a level that is needed within the community. So being able to be flexible within whatever your public space investment actually looks like. Another thing I want to think about is temporary, so back to retail, put my retail hattie on again, temporary selling. So, you know, we see in cities across the nation that they do not really allow for, you know, sidewalk vendors or, you know, people to pop up in a park. However, we have this call for entrepreneurship in many of our communities. That's all, we want to be community-based entrepreneurs. We want to be able to occupy a brick and mortar space, but we're supposed to go from not selling anything at all and then to making rent on this, whatever, if you're down, in a prime neighborhood in DC, $44, $50 a square foot, in rent, that's not a sound strategy for them. They need to understand, all right, how do I, who are my customers? How do I equate that over time to an actual physical brick and mortar space? And so I think as public markets serve in communities, that other public spaces could also serve that need. And so being flexible within policy writing, or even providing temporary stalls for them, like the Quinder Cut, in Detroit, they have temporary stalls over the summertime with emerging small businesses, just to allow people that are exercising or taking their kids out to the river for the weekend to access that amenity. And so thinking about not only the public space as a place for just community interaction that's non-commerce related, but also one that could spur wealth and hopefully be a point of engagement for everyone else as well.
This is great, and a perfect segue into the next question, which is much more about that, the exchange of capital between public and private spaces. But again, recognizing that there is a growing realization that public spaces would need additional resources post-COVID, and to create more public spaces in an equitable manner, so they're distributed in places where they're always, haven't always been great public spaces, improving access for those who haven't traditionally felt like they have access, thinking about maintenance and management. So for all of those things, our public spaces are going to require more resources. What opportunities do you see in the private sector that can be leveraged? And I actually want to start with you, Maggie, just reminding us of some of the financial relationships that already exist as public-private partnerships. What those are, if you can speak to them, and any additional ones that you wish existed as mechanisms.
Yeah, so Bobby actually touched on some of them in his last comment, really thinking about business improvement districts or public improvement districts. And as a reminder, that's where there's a tax assessment on the land that is approved by a specified geographic area. So people essentially are agreeing to pay additional funds in order to, provide various amenities that are, provided to that area. So that may be somebody helping to clean up, providing additional security, et cetera, et cetera. More commonly, which you'll see a lot with parks, is like you'll have a conservancy or a friends of group, right, that's raising money to ensure that those programs continue. But, some of those things aren't necessarily doesn't always necessarily make sense for certain areas, or it's just not advantageous or feasible. So in some of our more distressed areas, I think our comments previously around advocating on behalf of communities that need additional support. Or I'll give another local example. Well, actually, we'll take it national to local. Trust for Public Land, they actually have done a really great job here in Dallas. I'll give a shout out to Robert Kent, where they have, I would say, really like taken this national initiative around creating more public spaces and brought that down to the neighborhood level in Dallas. They have definitely advocated for a lot of additional bond money that goes across the city for various parks, but they also work in a wide range of communities, whether that is in downtown Dallas or for Dallas, the southern sector is where, you may see more people of color living there, but they are doing everything from, working on pocket parks and helping to get funding for that, to like doing short-term installations so people can kind of see how they might use that park, as well as helping to fund master plans for open spaces. And so that's, I think, is another really good example of, if you're a national organization that is working on these issues, how do you get somebody that is in the community, right, and then taking that piece of community engagement to advocate for open spaces across various neighborhoods in that work? And so I think they've done a really good job of that here locally.
Great, and I'm glad you pointed out about conservancies and organizations that raise capital to be able to do some of this work. And I know that such organizations that are led by people of color face a whole different challenge raising capital, and how certain organizations, depending on their leadership, are not as kind of automatically fit to philanthropic giving. And there's a huge challenge there that speaks to just decolonizing philanthropy and funding as well. So that's a whole other challenge that we hopefully maybe we'll do another webinar about that one day. But now I want to talk to you about Madison. Can you tell us about some innovative new ways in which public and private entities can work together and share capital, maybe not even transactional capital, just in other kinds of capital?
That is a good question. One of initially, the first thing that comes to mind kind of builds off of what Maggie was already mentioning with these public improvement districts or business improvement districts, whatever you want to call them for whatever city or state that you're in, but how they can reassess the funds that they already have that would typically go to things like marketing or recruiting new businesses and things like that to come to the area, et cetera. How can those funds be sort of refiltered to function in addressing COVID by either making things more sanitary or whatever that looks like, but also providing more space to people that maybe is monitored or something like that that they weren't previously paying for. As far as them working together to leverage their existing capital, I think the key would be looking at what sort of capital do they already have. And that's either land, their building and those assets, or their actual wealth and funds. I think we're seeing a really big issue on the funding side of things because cities are definitely constrained by what's going on and the way that the budget has been affected by that, and the general ledger is astronomical, honestly. So to ask them to provide more would be difficult, and at the same time, it'd be difficult to ask the businesses to provide more as well because everybody seems to be struggling. So as far as leveraging additional assets, I'm honestly not sure. I don't know, other than reallocating the funds that they've already got to make an area sort of better for the people who are using it right now so that they can at least access it. I don't know. I was hoping not to have an I don't know answer, but I really am not sure. And I think that when I figure that out, I'll provide it to everybody that I know, and we'll make all these cities a whole lot better. That's for sure. But I'm not entirely sure just because of the way the constraints working. So I think you'd have to use the funds that exist now to make things more available.
I think you did have an idea in there that you underplayed a little bit, which was the sharing of space. You know, so if there's private space that's available, not being utilized, that could. Can you build on that just for a second? I think there's something there.
Yeah, so I think working with landlords would probably go a long way, especially with these spaces that are either underutilized or are flat out vacant now. I think that would go an extremely long way. And then I think it's about choosing, it's almost like choosing which organization or which, not necessarily philanthropy, but which value it is that you want to push forward. And if that's something like the arts or helping the homeless population or providing food or groceries, I mean, I think you can use these empty spaces for that if you're working with the landlord and the landlords agreeable to that sort of partnership or relationship. And I'm sure that would not only go a long way for providing for these groups that aren't getting these opportunities, but in the long run, I think it would build the community up a lot more and make that a more desirable place to be. So you're right, maybe I do have ideas.
You do. I absolutely believe that, and I think that's a very powerful one because we already know mechanisms to figure out what are the biggest pain points in a community right now because everything is being exposed, and maybe we can think about addressing some of those pain points, addressing some of that trauma by utilizing the capital and the space and other things that we may already have available. Bobby, what do you think? What did we miss in the previous questions that we can address here? New mechanisms for creating that stronger public-private bond between the two.
So I think one is human capital is one capital that we don't talk a lot about within this, is how, some of the the private industries that are doing really well, how can they leverage, whether that's their staff or their resources in order to support their local economy. And so that, could look like, oh, we're going to subsidize common area maintenance costs for a developer who is trying to increase his provisions of sidewalk maintenance and, maybe even cleaning out off the street every day, whatever it may be, in order to help us get back after COVID. I love the idea of using vacant space. Within retail, we know that there's always an increase in vacant space year over year. That is, we're just over retailed. However, expansion is still occurring. And so with that comes new concepts, though. And some of those new concepts are very much so aligned with social impact. And so how can you, start to say, hey, I think that business is one of the ones that can not only, fill this vacancy, but they might also be willing to utilize some of their square footage for another use that could be more community oriented. And so thinking about creative strategies as a property owner is very important. And then understanding, what does another vertical look like for public space? So, public, we typically don't think about revenue generation and all these things, but, we all have to run each of these assets as businesses and how they can really start to pay for themselves in some ways. So, as the previous idea mentioned around like sidewalk vendors or, in park vendors, all right, can you have a vendor fee that, you charge on a weekly basis for each vendor that shows up? And they can then leverage that fund into some other opportunity. And that could, start off small and then, continue to grow as the market starts to prove itself. So I think what I'm pushing towards is more of this integration of space. It's not necessarily, public versus private, especially as you consider kind of the ground floor in commercial districts and or in park systems. It is a opportunity to create like this unique chances for businesses, people to commingle and to understand how they're each benefiting one another.
Can
Absolutely.
I actually co-sign on one thing, sorry,
Yep,
that Bobby
go for
said?
it.
I think that point around human capital cannot be understated, right? And I want to take that a little bit different direction of like challenging us to volunteer our time and working with some of these neighborhood associations, some of these nonprofit developers and community development corporations to push some of these ideas forward, right? Like in order to raise money or in order for them to be able to advocate for the type of public spaces that they need in their neighborhood, they need architects, they need designers, they need folks that are willing to, help do a small pop-up park in their neighborhood. And that may just be a really cool, addition to your portfolio, but it also, for that neighborhood and for that community, gives an example for helping them to advocate to get the resources to do the things that we're talking about today.
I absolutely agree. I think people who are able to stay employed and corporations who are able to keep their people employed without having a ton of work, how else can we use their skills in supporting the communities that may need those skills right now to actually fill that gap? And maybe it'll add to their portfolio, maybe not, but it'll help us collectively solve a social problem. So in the interest of time, the last question, which I don't want to ignore, but quickly address, because we could have a whole other webinar just about this one. This is really a two-part question almost, to give the advocates in our audiences avenues to pursue in their work, and to leave others with food for thought. And we know that changes to public policy is one of the strongest methods for systemic change. That is how, at least in the United States, some of the biggest changes to daily lives have occurred, for better or for worse. You know, New Deal or urban renewal or National Interstate and Defense Highway Act, and on and on and on. In this very crucial moment of trauma and reflection, what would be your one policy proposal for 2020 and 2021? 2 sentences. We'll start with Maggie.
So my quick thing is infrastructure, right? So as we have more money coming from the local or from federal government trickling to state and local government, let's have infrastructure, water, sewer, streets that goes into neighborhoods that have disproportionately been impacted by COVID-19, which is our Black and Brown communities.
All right, Bobby, you're up.
So I'm going to go to the federal level with my investment or policy change. It's really, I think, a way that HUD can leverage some of its funding mechanisms in order to provide good, essential goods and services in the communities that we need most. So that could be in an innovative public space, that could be in a private space, whatever that may look like. But to think about that as not only a long-term solution for goods and service, but also can be a workforce development program that could even spur off some worker cooperatives if they set it up correctly.
What do you think, Madison?
I'm going to go back to the local level and honestly just say some sort of ease in permitting to allow businesses to expand out into the open air. I think that could be done by most cities very soon, and I think that would offer a lot of help to a lot of businesses very soon. So.
Thank you. So we'll leave you with a closing slide and some resources that our panelists have put together for us as we thank them for really joining us today and sharing all their insights. It's been fantastic talking to the 3 of you. I am so fortunate you're in my network. I was able to talk to you. It's fantastic. We live for moments like this. And my hope would have been that this conversation would have occurred under different circumstances, but I'm still fortunate and thankful to have you in our network and to speaking with our audience. So these resources will be also added to our website along with a post-webinar recording. So please feel free to check out our previous webinars, recording of this webinar, share it with your networks and the people that you care about and want to talk to. And thank you so much for joining us today. You've been a fantastic audience.
Yes, we thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And thanks again for everybody on this panel. We appreciate everything you've had to say, and we know that our audience is currently having a lot of food for thought and can relate to everything that was discussed here. So again, we thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.